I stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, suitcase still gripping my hand, and felt my heart stop. The blue walls I'd painted years ago were half covered in pink. My sister Vivian sat cross-legged on the floor, phone propped against a stack of boxes, live streaming to her followers. She didn't even look up when I entered. My nameplate, the wooden one Dad carved when I was 7, lay crumpled in the trash bin beside her feet. The scent of fresh paint burned my nostrils as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Mom!" I called out, my voice catching slightly. She appeared behind me, wiping her hands on a dishcloth, her expression flat and unbothered. "Oh, Leo, you're early. What's happening to my room?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Mom sighed like I'd asked her to explain something obvious. "You don't live here anymore, Leo. You've been gone for 3 years. Vivian needs the space for her studio. She's building a brand now. Surely you understand." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. I sent money every month, called every week, dreamed of coming home to this exact room. But apparently I'd already been erased. I walked slowly to the porch, my legs heavy, my chest tight. Rain began to fall in soft, steady drops, tapping against the wooden steps where Dad and I used to sit and talk about everything and nothing. Inside, I could hear Vivian's laughter through the window, light and careless, as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just lost the last piece of my father in that house. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I sat down on the top step, letting the rain soak through my jacket. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure if it was from anger or grief. Maybe both. The house behind me felt like a stranger now, even though I'd grown up inside those walls, built shelves in the garage, carved my initials into the oak tree out back. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to fight for what was mine. But instead, I just sat there in the rain, silent and still, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost settle over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Somewhere in the storm, I heard my father's voice in my memory. "Son, kindness always outlasts anger." I didn't know if I believed that anymore. My name is Leo. I'm 28 years old, and until 3 years ago, this house was the center of my world. Dad was a carpenter just like me. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to feel the grain of wood beneath my fingertips, how to build something that would last. When he passed away suddenly from a heart attack, I was 25 and completely unprepared to lose him. Mom struggled after that. Bills piled up. The mortgage felt impossible. So I made a choice. I took a job overseas, working long hours on construction sites in countries I'd never heard of, sending almost every paycheck home. I called every Sunday, asked about the house, about repairs that needed doing, about whether Mom was managing okay. She always said yes, always said things were fine. I believed her because I wanted to, because I needed to think that my sacrifice meant something, that the house Dad built with his own hands would still be standing when I came home, that my room, with its blue walls and wooden nameplate, would be waiting for me like a promise kept. I should have known better. Things weren't always like this. I remember a time when we were a team. After Dad died, Mom, Vivian, and I would sit at the kitchen table every Sunday night, dividing up chores and talking about our weeks. Vivian was 16 then, still figuring out who she was. She helped with dishes, took out trash, complained about homework like any normal teenager. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. Vivian discovered social media, started posting videos of herself trying on clothes, giving makeup tutorials, talking about her life like it was a performance. Her follower count grew. Brands started sending her free products. Mom began watching those videos more than she talked to me on our Sunday calls. "Your sister's really making something of herself," Mom would say during our conversations, pride thick in her voice. I'd tell her about the bridge I helped build, the school we renovated, the skills I was learning. She'd hum politely and change the subject back to Vivian's latest sponsorship deal. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in attention, like the sun moving across the sky. But eventually, I realized I'd been left completely in shadow. By the time I came home, I wasn't just physically absent. I'd been emotionally erased too. I moved my belongings into the old garden shed behind the house that same evening. It smelled like rust and forgotten summers, filled with Dad's old tools and dusty boxes of Christmas decorations. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like lace, and the single window was cracked down the middle, letting in cold drafts that made me shiver. I set my suitcase down on the concrete floor and looked around. This wasn't how I'd imagined my homecoming. Not even close. But pride wouldn't let me beg for my room back, and I had nowhere else to go. Not yet, anyway. The shed was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a workbench Dad built years ago still standing sturdy against one wall. I found an old sleeping bag in a plastic bin, shook out the dust, and spread it across the floor. It would do for now. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of the house, hear faint music from Vivian's room, my old room. I tried not to feel bitter. Tried to remember what Dad used to say about accepting what you can't change. Instead, I picked up a hammer and started fixing the broken window. If I was going to sleep here, I'd make it livable. That's what carpenters do. We fix things. The next morning, I was sweeping the shed when I heard a crash outside. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, stood near the fence holding a broken bicycle, looking like he might cry. His chain had snapped, and the front wheel was bent at an awkward angle. "Need help?" I called out, walking over. He nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. I knelt down and examined the damage. Nothing I couldn't fix with the right tools. 20 minutes later, the bike was rideable again. The boy grinned so wide I couldn't help but smile back. "Thank you, mister," he said, hopping on and pedaling away. I watched him go, feeling something warm settle in my chest. Felt good to fix something, to be useful again.
An hour later, an elderly woman appeared at the fence, holding a thermos and 2 cups. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through me. "I'm Mrs. Althea," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You fixed my grandson's bicycle. I wanted to say thank you properly." We sat on the back steps of the shed and drank tea together. She didn't ask why I was living there. Didn't judge. Just talked about the weather, the neighborhood, and how grateful she was for kind strangers. For the first time since I'd come home, I didn't feel invisible. A few days later, Mrs. Althea knocked on the shed door again. This time, she had a request. Her front porch was rotting, she explained, and she worried someone might fall through the boards. She couldn't afford a contractor, but she'd heard I was handy with tools. "I'd be happy to help," I told her, grabbing my toolbox. Her house sat at the edge of town, a small cottage with peeling paint and a sagging roof. But inside, it smelled like cedar and lemon polish, warm and inviting. Photos covered the walls, faces of people I didn't recognize, all smiling at the camera. The furniture was old but well cared for, and a grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. As I worked on the porch, replacing rotten boards and reinforcing beams, I noticed something strange. One of the photos near the mantel showed a house that looked familiar. Very familiar. I squinted, leaning closer, and my breath caught. It was my house. My childhood home. But the photo was old, maybe 30 or 40 years, judging by the faded colors and the clothes people wore in the background. "Mrs. Althea?" I called inside. "This picture, whose house is this?" She appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "That belonged to my late husband's family. He helped build many homes in this town." "Why do you ask?" I swallowed. "That's my house. Where I grew up." She smiled faintly. "Small world, isn't it?" Over the following weeks, I spent more time at Mrs. Althea's house than my own. We worked side by side, sanding wood, fixing hinges, patching cracks in the walls. She told me stories about her husband, a builder who'd loved his craft the way my father had. He died 15 years ago, she said, but his hands lived on in every house he'd touched. "Your father," she said one afternoon, pausing mid-stroke with her paintbrush. "He was a carpenter too, wasn't he?" I nodded. "How did you know?" "I can see it in the way you work. Patient. Careful. Like you're building something that matters." We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then she said something that stuck with me. "A house keeps secrets, Leo. Even its walls don't understand all the stories they hold." I thought about my own house. About the mortgage Mom struggled with. About Dad's promise to keep it in the family. About how quickly I'd been pushed aside. Mrs. Althea must have seen something in my expression because she reached over and squeezed my hand gently. Whatever you're carrying, it won't break you. Trust that. I wanted to believe her. That evening, I returned to the shed and heard voices through the open window of the house. Vivian's voice, bright and mocking, echoed across the yard. "Can you believe Leo's living in the shed like some kind of hermit?" she said, laughing. "He's so dramatic. He could have just gotten an apartment." Her friends laughed with her. I waited for Mom to defend me. To say something, anything, that showed she cared. But she didn't. The house stayed silent except for Vivian's continued giggles. I sat down on the shed floor, my back against the wall, and felt tears prick my eyes. I'd given up 3 years of my life for this family. Sent money. Sacrificed opportunities. And this was how they saw me. Dramatic. Pathetic. Invisible. I pulled out my notebook, the one Dad gave me before he died, and started sketching. Not plans for the shed. Not repairs for my own space. Instead, I drew detailed plans for Mrs. Althea's house. A new porch. A reinforced roof. A garden that would bloom in spring. If I couldn't fix my own family, at least I could fix something beautiful for someone who deserved it. Days turned into weeks. I poured myself into restoring Mrs. Althea's home. I rebuilt her porch from scratch, replaced her broken gate, and even replanted her garden with flowers she said her husband used to love. The work was hard, but it felt meaningful in a way nothing else had in years. Townspeople started noticing. Neighbors waved when they saw me working. A few stopped by to thank me for helping Mrs. Althea. One older man, Mr. Keegan, even brought me lunch one afternoon and told me I reminded him of my father. "Your dad was a good man," he said, shaking my hand firmly. Glad to see his son turned out the same. Mrs. Althea started calling me my late husband's hands, and every time she said it, I felt a little less broken. The shed stopped feeling like exile. It started feeling like purpose. One afternoon, while I hammered new shingles onto her roof, she called up to me. "You've brought this old place back to life, Leo. I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," I called back, meaning it. She smiled, her eyes misty. "You're building more than wood here. You know that, don't you?" I didn't answer. But deep down, I hoped she was right. One morning, I arrived at Mrs. Althea's house to find the front door slightly ajar. I knocked, calling her name, but got no answer. Stepping inside, I noticed the house felt different. Quieter. Almost expectant. On the mantel, beside the ticking grandfather clock, sat an envelope. It was old, yellowed at the edges, addressed in careful handwriting, to the rightful heir of Oak Lane House. Oak Lane House. That was the old name for my family's home, before it was just known as the Caldwell Place. My stomach tightened. I reached for the letter, then hesitated. It wasn't addressed to me. It felt wrong to read someone else's private mail. I set it back down carefully and finished the day's work, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in the shed, I dreamed of my father. He was in our old garage, hammering something I couldn't see, humming the tune he always hummed when he worked. When he noticed me watching, he smiled. "Be patient, son," he said, his voice clear as day. "The truth builds itself. You just have to give it time." I woke up with tears on my face, unsure if the dream was memory or message. 2 days later, I knocked on Mrs. Althea's door and got no answer. I tried the handle. Locked. The curtains were drawn tight, and the porch light was off. I walked around back. Everything looked untouched, but something felt wrong. I asked the neighbor, Mrs. Beatrice, if she'd seen Mrs. Althea. "Oh, she left a few days ago," Beatrice said, watering her plants. "Said she had family business to attend to. Didn't say when she'd be back." I thanked her and walked back to the house, my mind spinning. Mrs. Althea had never mentioned family. Never talked about leaving. And she'd seemed fine just days before. Her cat, an old orange tabby named Rusty, sat on the porch steps, meowing pitifully. I sat down beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Where'd she go, buddy?" I whispered. Rusty just blinked at me, as if to say he wished he knew. I fed the cat from a bag of food I found in the shed and promised him I'd check back tomorrow. But as I walked away, a strange unease settled over me. Something wasn't right. Mrs. Althea wouldn't just leave without saying goodbye. Not after everything we'd shared. When I got back to the shed that evening, I realized my toolbox was missing. I searched everywhere, panic rising in my chest. Those tools had belonged to my father. They were all I had left of him. I stormed into the house, my composure finally cracking. "Mom, have you seen my tools?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She glanced up from her phone, barely interested. "Oh, those? I sold them." The room tilted. "You what?" "We needed the money, Leo. And you weren't using them for anything important. Just fixing some old lady's porch." My hands clenched into fists. Those were Dad's tools. "They were sitting in a shed collecting dust," she said, her tone dismissive. "Don't be so dramatic." I stood there, shaking with rage and heartbreak, and realized something crucial. This house, this family, they didn't see me anymore. Maybe they never really had. I turned and walked out without another word. Back in the shed, I sat on the floor and let the tears come. Not just for the tools. For everything. For the father I missed. For the family I'd lost without realizing it. For the home that had stopped being mine long before I ever left. 3 days later, the postman knocked on the shed door. He handed me a thick envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in Mrs. Althea's careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a small brass key and a folded piece of paper. No letter. No explanation. Just the key and a single sentence written on the paper, "For the study. 3rd drawer." I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. Then I grabbed my jacket and ran to Mrs. Althea's house. The brass key fit perfectly into the front door lock. Inside, the house felt hollow, like it had been holding its breath. I walked to the study, a small room off the main hallway I'd only glanced at before. The 3rd drawer of the old oak desk was locked. But the same brass key opened it with a soft click. Inside were documents. Old property deeds. Letters written in faded ink. And at the top of the pile, a piece of paper with 2 signatures I recognized, my father's, and someone named Vincent Althea. I sat down, my legs weak, and began to read. With every line, my understanding of everything shifted. The documents told a story I'd never known. 30 years ago, Vincent Althea, Mrs. Althea's late husband, had owned the land where my house now stood. He'd sold it to my father under specific conditions. The house would remain in family trust, never to be refinanced or resold outside the family line. It was meant to be a legacy. A promise between builders who understood the value of home. My father had agreed. Signed the contract. Built the house with his own hands, knowing it would be passed down to me someday. But after Dad died, Mom had secretly refinanced the house to cover debts I didn't know about. She'd broken the trust clause. According to the legal papers in front of me, that breach meant the property rights reverted back to the Althea estate. My mother didn't own the house. She never had. Not legally. And Mrs. Althea had known this entire time. I sat back in the chair, my mind reeling. All those weeks working together, all those conversations, she'd been watching me. Testing me. Trying to see what kind of man I was before deciding what to do with this knowledge. My hands shook as I reached for the final document at the bottom of the drawer. It was a letter written in Mrs. Althea's handwriting, dated just a week ago. "Dear Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have left the decision in your hands. I've watched you these past weeks, seen the kindness you carry even when you've been hurt. My husband built this town on promises, and your father honored those promises with his whole heart. When your mother broke the trust, I had every legal right to reclaim the property. But I waited. I wanted to see if his son carried the same honor." My throat tightened. "The deed to your family's home now rests with my estate. Legally, it belongs to me. But morally, it belongs to those who understand what a home truly means. You've proven yourself, Leo. Not through anger or revenge, but through quiet kindness. The decision of what happens next is yours to make. I trust you will choose wisely. With deep respect, Althea." I set the letter down, my vision blurred with tears. She'd given me power. Complete power. I could take the house back. Throw my mother and sister out. Make them feel the same rejection they'd made me feel. Or I could do something else entirely. I spent that night in the study, reading and rereading the documents until I understood every detail. The house legally belonged to Mrs. Althea's estate. She'd quietly purchased the refinanced debt years ago, but never enforced her ownership. Just watched. Waited. Now she was gone, leaving me with a choice that felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried. Part of me wanted revenge. Wanted to see the shock on Mom's face when she realized she'd been living in a house that wasn't hers. Wanted Vivian to understand what it felt like to lose something precious. But another part of me, the part that sounded like my father, whispered something different. A house isn't about ownership, son. It's about what you do inside it. The love you build. The memories you create. I closed my eyes, remembering Dad's hands guiding mine as I learned to hammer my first nail. Remembering his laughter when I measured wrong. Remembering his pride when I finally got it right. He'd want me to choose kindness. Even now. Even after everything. By morning, I knew what I had to do. It wouldn't be easy. It would hurt. But it would be right. That weekend, Mom threw a party to celebrate Vivian's latest brand deal. The house was full of people I didn't know, music thumping through the walls, laughter spilling into the yard where I sat in the shed, watching through the window. Mom stood in the living room, glass of wine in hand, telling everyone about Vivian's success. About her future. About how proud she was. No one mentioned me. No one even knew I was home. I watched the celebration with detached curiosity, like I was observing strangers. These people had been my family once. Now they felt like actors in a play I no longer wanted to watch. Thunder rumbled overhead. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the shed roof. I stood up, grabbed the documents from Mrs. Althea's study, and tucked them inside my jacket. It was time. I walked across the yard, rain soaking through my clothes, and stepped through the back door into the crowded house. Conversations paused as people noticed me. Vivian looked up from her phone, startled. Leo? What are you doing inside? You're dripping everywhere. I ignored her and walked straight to the living room where Mom stood mid-story, surrounded by her guests. Mom, I said quietly. We need to talk. Now. Mom's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. Leo, this isn't the time. We're celebrating. I know, I said, pulling the deed from my jacket and placing it on the coffee table. But this can't wait. The room fell silent. Everyone's eyes moved from the document to me, curiosity replacing celebration. Mom picked up the paper, her face paling as she read the first few lines. What is this? It's the deed to this house, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. The real one. The one that shows who actually owns it. Vivian laughed nervously. What are you talking about? Mom owns this house. No, I said, looking directly at her. She doesn't. She never did. Not legally. Mom's hands trembled. Leo, where did you get this? From Mrs. Althea. The woman whose house I've been fixing. The widow of the man who originally owned this land and sold it to Dad under a family trust agreement. I pulled out the original contract and laid it beside the deed. When you refinanced the house after Dad died, you broke that agreement. The property rights reverted to the Althea estate. She's owned this house for years. She just never told you. The room erupted in whispers. Mom sank into the nearest chair, her face white. Vivian snatched the papers off the table, scanning them frantically. This can't be real. It's some kind of mistake. It's not, I said quietly. It's all legally documented. Notarized. Filed with the county. Dad promised this house would stay in our family, that it would never be sold or refinanced outside the trust. But you broke that promise, Mom. And there are consequences. Mom looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know, Leo. I swear I didn't know about the trust. The bank offered the refinance and I was desperate. The bills were overwhelming and you were gone and I just needed help. For a moment, I felt my resolve waver. But then I remembered the trash bin with my nameplate. The tools she'd sold. The months of feeling invisible while she celebrated Vivian's every achievement. I was sending money every month, I said, my voice breaking slightly. You weren't alone, Mom. You just didn't want to see me. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing. Vivian stood frozen, still clutching the papers, her expression shifting from disbelief to fear. So what happens now? She whispered. Are you kicking us out? Everyone waited for my answer. The power to destroy them sat in my hands like a loaded weapon. One word and they'd lose everything. I took a deep breath. No, I'm not. The room exhaled collectively. Mom looked up, confusion mixing with her tears. You're not? She asked. No, I repeated. Because taking this house back for myself wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't heal what's broken between us. It would just make me as small as you made me feel. I picked up the deed and the trust documents, holding them carefully. Mrs. Althea knew what she was doing when she gave me these papers. She wanted to see what kind of person I'd become, whether I'd choose revenge or something better. Vivian set down the papers, her hands shaking. Then what are you going to do? I looked around the room, at all these people who'd been celebrating in a house built on my father's broken dreams. I'm going to honor Dad's real wish. Not ownership. Legacy. This house was supposed to shelter family. To be a place of love and safety. It hasn't been that for a long time. Mom stood up, reaching for me. Leo, please. I'm signing the property over to a foundation, I continued, my voice firm but gentle. The Althea Trust. They help families who are starting over. Families who need shelter and second chances. This house will become exactly what Dad intended, a home that matters. The party guests quietly left after that, murmuring awkward goodbyes. Soon it was just the three of us, Mom, Vivian, and me, standing in the living room that suddenly felt too large and too empty all at once. You're really doing this? Vivian asked, her voice small. I am, I said. But you'll have time to find somewhere else. The foundation doesn't evict families. They work with them, help them transition. You'll be okay. Mom sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. I ruined everything, didn't I? I sat down beside her, feeling years of anger slowly drain away. You made mistakes, Mom. We all did. But this isn't about punishment. It's about making something good from something broken. She looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time since I'd come home. Your father would be proud of you, she whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't see that sooner. The next morning, I returned to Mrs. Althea's house one last time. The key still fit. The house still smelled like cedar and lemon. On the kitchen table, I found fresh flowers in a vase and one final letter propped against them. You've rebuilt more than wood, Leo, it read. You rebuilt what men too often forget, honor, grace, and the courage to choose kindness when anger would be easier. My husband would have called you brother. I call you the son I never had. Build well. Build true. The world needs more carpenters like you. I sat at that table and wept until the sun rose. 6 weeks later, I stood outside my childhood home watching contractors install a sign, the Althea Trust Community Shelter. The house had been transformed. Fresh paint. New windows. A ramp for accessibility. Inside, families were already moving in, parents with tired eyes and children with cautious hope. Mom and Vivian stood beside me, paintbrushes in hand. They'd volunteered to help with the renovation, working quietly alongside me to repair what they'd broken. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Not completely. But it was a start. I never understood what Dad meant about building legacies, Vivian said, watching a little girl skip up the front steps. I thought success was about followers and brand deals. But this, she gestured to the house. This actually matters, doesn't it? Yeah, I said. It does. Mom touched my arm gently. Thank you for showing us there's a better way. For being the man your father raised. I didn't respond, just pulled them both into a hug. We stood there together, three broken people trying to rebuild something true, while the house my father built opened its doors to shelter others. The foreman called my name. They needed help hanging interior doors. I squeezed Mom's shoulder and headed inside, my hands ready to build again. The shelter's official opening came on a Saturday morning in late spring. The yard was full of children playing, parents chatting nervously, volunteers setting up tables of donated food and supplies. Mrs. Althea's foundation director, a kind woman named Fiona, gave a speech about second chances and the power of community. When she asked me to say a few words, I almost refused. Public speaking had never been my strength. But I thought of Dad, of Mrs. Althea, of all the people who'd believed I could be better than my pain. So I stood up and walked to the makeshift podium. My dad built this house with his own hands, I began, my voice shaking slightly. He wanted it to be a place where family could grow and thrive. For a while, we forgot what that meant. We forgot that family isn't about ownership or who gets the biggest room. It's about shelter. About making space for each other, especially when times are hard. I looked at Mom and Vivian in the crowd. They were crying, holding each other. This house almost became a place of bitterness and broken promises. But someone very wise showed me that we always have a choice. We can build walls, or we can build bridges. Today, we're building bridges. The crowd applauded. Children ran past, laughing. The house glowed in the afternoon sun, alive again with purpose. I stepped back from the podium, dusty and exhausted and more at peace than I'd been in years. Now it finally feels like home, I whispered, knowing somehow that Dad and Mrs. Althea were both smiling. That evening, after everyone had gone, I sat alone on the front porch steps. The same steps where Dad and I used to talk. Where I'd cried in the rain the day I came home. Where everything had changed. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a final entry: kindness doesn't wait for fairness. It builds, even when everything's broken. And someday when truth returns, it always finds the one who kept building. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom: dinner at our new apartment tomorrow? Vivian's cooking. No promises it'll be good. I smiled and typed back, I'll be there. The shed behind the house had been converted into a tool library for shelter residents. My father's replacement tools hung on the wall, available for anyone who needed them. It felt right. Dad always said tools were meant to be used, not stored away. As I stood to leave, I noticed something carved into the porch railing. Fresh. Recent. Words I didn't recognize at first, for Leo, who remembered how to build home. Mrs. Althea's handwriting. She must have carved it before she left, knowing I'd find it eventually. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling the groove she'd made, and understood finally what she'd been trying to teach me. A home isn't who owns it. It's who restores it. Who chooses to build something beautiful even when the blueprint gets torn apart. I'd lost my room. But I'd found something far more valuable. I'd found my way home.